When I first saw Sandeep Jauhar do an interview on CNN about his journey with his father's experience of dementia and decline, I was moved. And I think it was barely after I had begun trying to put this fellowship together. And I thought, wouldn't he be just the ultimate get for this session? Sandeep Jauhar is a cardiologist for Long Island Jewish Hospital, but he is also the author of an extremely poignant memoir called My Father's Brain. It's about his journey, learning about what was happening with his father and learning about this extraordinarily challenging and complex issue of caregiving, long-term caregiving for our families, obviously for our seniors, but just in general. So Sandeep, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to come and join us and talk about what you've been through.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I'll just start off by saying that multitasking is bad for the brain.
Now you tell me. Oh, it's a little too
I do
late.
it myself.
Well, if this interview goes off the rails, then you will know why. So I thought the best way for us to begin this journey is for you to tell us about your father. Tell us about who he was and your memories of him growing up.
Yeah, no, so my father was actually a very distinguished geneticist. He was born in India. He grew up in poverty in a city called Kanpur. Well, before the partition of India, they were in what is today Pakistan, but they migrated, forced migration during the partition, ended up in Kanpur, and he grew up in poverty. And I think that experience really shaped his life and his career decisions. So he decided to go into plant genetics, crop sciences, to create more durable crop plants to increase food production for India's poor. And that was like sort of the scientific motivation that really propelled his entire career. So we lived in India for a short while. We moved to England, eventually settled in the U.S., in Southern California, a place called Riverside. And, he was just really so focused on his creative intellectual life. That was so important to him. And in fact, he wrote a advance directive, which maybe we'll get into later, that said something along the lines of, if your mother and I ever get very sick, we would not want extraordinary measures taken to keep us alive. And that actually became a very difficult thing to navigate toward the end of his life, because he did develop dementia, and we can talk about sort of the steps, but I'm jumping ahead because...
Let me jump in here and ask you to give us some examples of what you mean by his interest in developing his intellectual life. When you were a kid, what did you see about him? What did you notice about him in that regard?
Well, I mean, he spent a lot of time in the laboratory. He was actually the first scientist to create a hybrid tomato plant, where he actually shot a wheat gene into a tomato plant, or it actually was a potato gene. He created the first tomato, and was actually written about in the Wall Street Journal. And so, he was a very creative scientist. And, the first time I actually came to know that there was a problem with him was when he called me up one day, this was probably in 2012, and said, they want me they meaning, the administration my parents lived in Fargo, North Dakota, and which had really one of the preeminent wheat genetics programs in the world. And he was a full professor there. And he said, they want me to write 2 papers a year. And I don't know if I can do that. And I said, Dad, what are you talking about? You've written, hundreds of scientific papers in some of the most esteemed journals in the world. This is not going to be a problem for you. And he said, I really don't know if I can do it. And, I was living in New York, and like a lot of people, a lot of families, ours kind of splintered after the kids went to college and we went to graduate school. So my brother and I were living in New York. My parents were living in Fargo, and we really weren't up on what was going on. And this is not surprising. I mean, those of you who are journalists in this sphere know that the sort of the transformation of the American family from sort of a multi-generational unit, which was really the norm about 100 years ago, 120 years ago or so. A lot of families lived on farms. And there was always someone around to help out when people got sick. And then because of a lot of different factors, including industrialization and the rise of technology and migration to the cities, the family became more nuclear. And that's kind of what happened to our family. When we were in India, there were a lot of generations living under the same roof, or if they weren't under the same roof, they were living like down the block. There was always someone to call on. But when my parents moved to the U.S., the thought was that eventually, we'd all kind of live together, or close by. But that's not how things work, Kids today, we were like that. They sort of grow up and they want to blaze their own paths, and that's exactly what happened. We kind of moved. My sister moved to Minneapolis. My brother was in New York. I was in California for a while. Then I moved to St. Louis and whatever. So we weren't really up on what was going on with our parents. And so when my dad said, look, I'm not sure if I can write this, I kind of dismissed it as, that you're going to be fine. So he started spending a lot of time in the lab working on these papers and seemingly wasn't making any progress. And eventually, at the time, my mother was declining from Parkinson's disease. Yes, it's just a wonderful family story. So my mother had Parkinson's. My father had some issue that we didn't really understand, but we were pressing him, look, you need to retire and move closer to us.
And what year was this?
In New York. So he first talked about the inability, his worries in 2012, and eventually moved in 2014 to New York with my mother, ostensibly because my mother was declining. But it was pretty clear after my parents arrived in New York that my father there were some major issues going on with him. He was forgetting things. He forgot the code to my mother's to his new safe in his home. It was my mother's birth year, 1941. Kept forgetting. He would tell the same stories all over and over again. Some of the sort of classic signs of Alzheimer's. But even though I had been to medical school, I had done neurology rotations, I was a full-fledged cardiologist, I was really at a loss to explain what was going on with him.
Is part of that because of who he was and his intellect and that brilliant mind that I'm sure that you revered growing up?
Yeah.
He influenced you into moving into the medical field, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, he always wanted me to become a doctor, and I actually went to Berkeley and I studied physics. And I remember one day I told my dad, I'm not going to go to medical school, I'm going to study physics. And he's like, okay, that's fine. So that was kind of the twisted world I lived in, where rebellion was saying no to a career in medicine, but then going into physics. I mean, he was very science oriented. His favorite saying was, non-science is nonsense. And of course, I was very interested in writing as well as science. And so he would tell me, that's fine. You can write all you want, but you have to have sort of, a pragmatic dimension to your career. And eventually I listened and got out of college and ended up going to medical school. But I think you point out a really important point, that it's what's the absolute sort of level at which someone is and what's the relative change. And absolute level, my dad was still, reading the newspaper. You could still have a conversation about current events. He was, if you asked him about the textbooks he had written, he would probably tell you all about, genes and translocations and all this other stuff. But, there were relative changes. He had dropped clearly from what where he was at. I mean, his memory was, especially short-term memory, was declining. And, I was kind of like, maybe this is moving to New York, like taking him out of his element where he was going to the lab every day, and he had a good social network. Maybe once he makes friends and, gets used to the new community, things are going to get better. I was in denial too. He was in denial.
Well, as you said in the book, and again, I urge you to listen to Sandeep read about his experience. It adds a certain level of intensity to it. But you say that he started to write checks to various foundations or individuals or scams, really.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that really sort of pushed you into a hard reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing when someone tells the same story over and over again. It's another when they take out $2,100 from the bank in cash. My mother, because of Parkinson's, we hired caregivers to help her. So people were coming in and out of the house. I told my dad, look, you cannot take this much cash out of the bank. And my brother and I would say several times a month, go and steal from my dad and go and put it back into his bank account. And he had no idea that he had, where the money had gone. So we knew that he was just like a setup for, to be taken advantage of. And a lot of elderly people, as I'm sure as being journalists in this field, are victims of, financial abuse. But, it was really my mother who actually finally uttered the word Alzheimer's. Like I said, I was in a bit of a denial. I thought, okay, he's going to bounce back once he's gets into the swing of things in his new home. And my mother, she was walking one day and she told me the story about how he had driven to the mall and he forgot his way back home. I said, well, that's not such a big deal, I mean, this is a new community and, he wasn't exactly one to use a driving app or Google Maps or whatever. So I said, okay, so he got lost. She said, yeah, but, he pulled off on the side of the main road, this main thoroughfare. There was like a 4-lane road, pulled off to the side and actually walked into traffic to try to, hail for help. I said, that's not normal. And my mother, we were walking home, and I remember distinctly when we got to the steps, she turned to me and said, do you think your dad has Alzheimer's? And that was the first time anyone in the family had uttered those words, because Alzheimer's, dementia, there's just so much taboo associated with that word. And for my mother especially, we moved to the United States in 1977 when Alzheimer's was just entering the national conversation. Because prior to that, the disease was thought to be one that affected young people, sort of early onset dementia. But the late onset Alzheimer's which was essentially the same disease, but it wasn't recognized as such. Late onset was thought to be like senility, or something that's on the spectrum of normal. But in the mid-1970s, it came to be understood that late onset and early onset essentially are the same disease, the same physiology, the same pathology, the same sort of clinical manifestations. And so, I remember when we moved in 1977, there were like documentaries on and sort of news shows about Alzheimer's. It's like this, it's almost within, let's say, like half a decade, it can be recognized as the fourth leading cause of death in American society. So that was the sort of context that my mother started to learn about Alzheimer's. It was just like this horrible thing where people lose independence, they might need institutional living, and so no one really wanted to talk about it. After she mentioned this, I said, look, we need to take him to a neurologist. The neurologist did some neuropsychiatric testing and said, your dad has MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And this is, I'll tell you, this is still, I'm astonished that, I know so much about dementia now, but in 2014, after we went to the neurologist, November 2014, after he mentioned MCI, I have to confess, I didn't even know what that was. And I'd gone through medical school. So
let me jump in here before we get to this aspect of you coming to terms with what you had to learn. Another aspect about your story that I found interesting, I believe it's just you, your brother, and your sister. Is that it? 3 siblings. You mentioned that in your Indian culture, the daughter doesn't really have a key role. The task of caring for family really would fall on the sons. Am I remembering that correctly?
So there's a difference between reality and sort of cultural ideals. So the cultural ideal in India is that sons take care of aging parents, usually the eldest son. So there's no Social Security in India. There are very few social services. Social Security is having a son. So my parents were very sort of traditionally minded, and they would tell us when we were kids, when we get old, it's you and your brother are going to be taking care of us. And my dad would say, we wiped your bottoms when you were kids. And it was clear he expected repayment in kind. But the reality was that my sister, and this is true, I traveled around the world researching this book and talking to people, talking to caregivers. The vast majority are women. It's true in America, it's true in India. Mostly it's daughters or daughters-in-law. And it's really a huge burden because most caregivers are not equipped to become caregivers. My parents did not want to move close to my sister because in their sort of perception of things, she had moved into a different family and they really had no kind of right to ask her to take care of them or to help them. My brother and I were also both doctors, so that probably plays a bit of a role as well. But yeah, I think they were prisoners of their culture. And, if I'm honest, I have to say that moving to Long Island to be close to my brother and me was a decision that they probably regretted. Because, we were doctors, we are doctors, we had our own families, and, we were in that weird, people call it the middle place or whatever it is, where you have young kids and you have aging parents.
Sandwich generation.
The sandwich generation. And, what I wrote in the book is, because of, alluding to my physics past, is there's something called the triple point of pressure of water, where there's a temperature and pressure where water exists as both a liquid, a solid, and a gas. And that was the weird point that I used to feel I was at, where I was a father, a husband, and a son, and all those roles were in this weird kind of uneasy equilibrium, and I didn't know how much to focus on one or the other, and a lot of people deal with that. And
I definitely want to talk about that a bit later when we talk about the mental health impacts and the needs. But let's get back to you realizing in 2014 that you had never heard of this term MC,
MCI, yeah, mild cognitive impairment.
Right. And as I saw in the first interview that I saw of you on CNN, you mentioned you wanted to write the book because if someone with your scientific research background was as absolutely just, clueless and had no idea, you put yourself in the place of so many other millions of families.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge knowledge gap. I mean, if as a doctor I knew next to nothing that was practical and something useful about dementia, then I can only imagine, and I came to understand in the course of traveling the world and talking to people, that there's just a huge deficit in understanding about what dementia is and how to cope with it. And I think that's the reason why caregivers, almost every caregiver I've ever spoken to has huge regrets. I have huge regrets about the job I did as a caregiver because, it's very frustrating, and it's even more frustrating when you don't know what's happening, when you don't know, why is my father telling the same story over and over again? Well, what I came to understand is that Alzheimer's typically starts in an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for the retention of short-term experience. So, has anyone ever watched the film Memento? Okay, so the character in that film has no short-term memory. He cannot remember anything. So, and that's based on a true story that I write about in the book. A gentleman named Henry Molaison, I return to that story over and over again to try to explain what's going on with Alzheimer's and memory deficits. But then, it's the memory stuff is very frustrating, but it's the emotional turbulence that becomes really difficult to handle. And so what I learned is that the amygdala, which regulates emotional responses, is right next to the hippocampus. So typically Alzheimer's starts in the hippocampus. You develop these memory deficits. It moves out to the amygdala. You get this sort of emotional volatility. And then eventually it moves to the parietal and frontal lobes, where you lose kind of the sense of awareness, self-awareness. So that's exactly what happened to my father. Memory deficits, followed by emotional volatility, followed by us saying, look, we can't do this on our own. You need to have a live-in caregiver. We will pay for it, but you have to, because we can't trust you to live alone anymore. You're leaving the stove on. You're wandering outside. We're driving from the hospital. We're leaving work to go find you. We can't do this anymore. And so that became, sorry, I lost my own train of thought. What's happening to me?
There's a lot to unpack. But what I would like you to maybe tell us a little bit more about is you had both parents were facing challenges at that time. Talk us about the orchestration of caregiving, finding caregivers, finding the appropriate ones for your mom's challenges and your dad's.
Yeah, I mean, there are something like 19 million family caregivers in the U.S., and none of them are trained. And they very often take on such huge responsibilities that they develop their own health problems, depression, loss of job productivity. They often have to leave their jobs. Very often it's women who are doing this, and so they suffer the brunt of it. It becomes like it's really a massive problem. I would say that there's several gaps. One is sort of a knowledge gap, which I try to address through the book. Providing a neurological blueprint for caregivers to understand what's going on, so that they can be more patient. In ways that probably I wasn't. But then there's also a huge resource gap. Like, my brother and I are both physicians. We had the resources to hire someone to help my father. We did not want him to go to a nursing home. that became a big thing later in the book, because I was kind of adamant that he should never go to a nursing home. And my brother and my sister became sort of more open to the idea when he was doing crazy things and wandering, but no one ever asked the question, well, if someone doesn't want to go to a nursing home, how do you keep them there, without just locking them up, And so it just clearly wasn't going to work for a headstrong, former intellectual like my father. So yeah, we hired a caregiver, but my father was, he lost self-awareness. He didn't understand that he needed help. That in itself, and I explore this in the book, is really a very multidimensional, very complex issue.
Tell us more about what do you mean by that?
Well, is loss of self-awareness just a form of amnesia, where you're forgetting your recent experiences, but you're holding on to long-term memories of the person you used to be, a functioning scientist, someone who drove a car without a problem, someone who gave plenary, talks to thousands of people. He was all those things, and so is it a form of amnesia? That's what I initially started to think, and then I went to talk to an expert at Washington University in St. Louis, where I went to medical school actually, and he explained that there's sort of a neurological substrate for even the loss of self-awareness, or the loss of what some people might call metacognition. That kind of awareness typically is formed in networks in the parietal and frontal lobes, and when they get obliterated, people lose a sense of that they need help, that they're making mistakes, that they lose an ability to appreciate error. And that's exactly what happened to my father. And so even though we had the resources, he kept kicking the caregiver out of the house, and you'd call the police. So what do you do? So that actually brings me to a point that I think needs to be addressed, which is that the problem with my father and the caregiver was that he didn't think she should be paid. He was of the mindset that she's living in our house. I'm providing food and shelter. And I said, Dad, and this was like a recurring thing, because we're all prisoners of our brains. I was a prisoner of my brain. I was a prisoner of my rational mind, telling my father, Dad, you know damn well that people don't work for free. You know this. He's like, I don't know this at all. She's living here. She should. So my brother and my sister said every time she was paid, he would kick her out of the house. He said, that's it. I'm not never. So we would pay her, but somehow it would get to him that she was paid, and it got to him from yours truly, me. I kept telling him, she's being paid, Dad. Why? I don't know. But I would say that a big part of it was that I refused to treat him like a child. My brother and sister would say, she's working for free, Dad. She's just living room and board. And I said, no. And I can't do that, because my father and we were always straight with each other. And continue to be straight with him, because for me, telling him the truth was like telling him, you're still a part of this world. You're still a person who's worth reckoning with. And telling him these lies, well, first of all, I didn't think he would even believe them, but irrespective of that, it was just, to me, it seemed unethical. I've changed my mind about that, and I eventually did even while he was alive. But for the longest time, I was just very adamant that we need to level with him, tell him the truth, and the sort of the philosophy of that, some people would call it reality orientation. It used to be the norm in caring for people with dementia, is you tell someone, look, hey, it's Tuesday, March 21st, and you're living here in this nursing home, and this is not your home, and your children don't live here, and they may visit in a week, something like that. And also, and I did this as well, your wife died. If my father were to ask, where's your mom? I would tell him, Dad, Mom died. She died of Parkinson's. And she died 3 years ago, and nothing we say is going to bring her back. Whereas my brother would say, like, stop being such an asshole. like, he's going to forget, he's going to ask again, and he's going to suffer again. So why are you doing this? And eventually, I came to understand that there's a difference between lying for your own benefit and lying for someone else's benefit. But it took me a long time. I was very kind of stuck in this sort of philosophical kind of idealism that was hard for me to break out of.
Conferring respect on him by not treating him like a child or lying.
Yeah.
You were still, I get it.
Yeah.
I was there at one point myself.
But telling someone the truth, I came to understand, is not the only way to confer dignity. There is a conception of dignity where you meet someone where they are. He's incapable of retaining memories. You don't want to hurt him anymore, so you tell him, as my brother would tell him, Mom's on her way. She's on a plane. Oh, can I talk to her? Well, Dad, she's on a plane. You can't talk to someone on a plane, right? He'd be like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And then you'd be calm, and these are the kinds of ethical conundra that caregivers go through every day. Do you lie? Do you tell the truth? And I was no different. So a big part for me in writing this book was to explore some of these experiences, and as a hope that they might provide, because caregiving is so lonely. I mean, I felt very lonely, even though I had a brother who was helping out a lot, and my sister was also intimately involved. But there are caregivers, like I said, mostly women, daughters and daughters-in-law, who are really doing this alone. And it's incredibly lonely. And so my hope was to write a book that would provide some kind of balm or solace to people who are going through this.
I wanted to talk to you about the issue of resources as well.
Yeah.
One of the things we'll be doing over the next few days is going to a senior care facility in North or Southeast Washington. We were originally going to go to one in Northwest, upper middle class, mostly white neighborhood, but Congress Heights is primarily African American, lower income. The issue at hand is, as journalists, do we cover, or what's the story? What's the real story about the long-term care crisis? People with resources, in other words, they're going to be able to find people to care for their parents. They're going to be able to
maybe
possibly
not. Maybe
well,
not.
but in theory,
Yeah.
they might have the financing. But the point
They
is,
may have finances, but there aren't people to
and
do
so
the care.
That's the whole thing I wanted you to address.
Yeah.
In that
It's huge.
people make that assumption that
Yeah.
money takes care of everything.
It doesn't.
So talk to me about, for you, what the greatest challenges were. Even though you had the ability to hire people, what were the complex mental health challenges and issues?
Yeah, I mean, there were cultural issues. My father was a traditional Indian man. He liked to eat Indian food. We went through some caregivers who were not from India, and it didn't work out. So there are, I think the ideal is to have some sort of cultural compatibility. We fortunately were able to find, a godsend in Harwinder, the caregiver, who really ends up being like the hero of the story in a lot of ways. I think a lot of readers have responded with that. But we were extraordinarily lucky to find her. But there are all sorts of issues. First, if you don't have the resources, then you can. So if you have too much money, you have to shelter your resources. If you do that, we found out that if my father eventually was eligible for Medicaid, he would lose Harwinder. You know what I mean? So it's we couldn't choose who we wanted to care for him. He had already developed this long, it was not easy because he wasn't easy, but she was extraordinarily patient and she was extraordinarily good for him. And so eventually my brother and I said, look, even if we save money, we can't, we don't want to interfere with this relationship that finally has gelled and it's working out. So, but a lot of families don't have that, the resources to fall back on. And then compounding the problem is that, a lot of caregivers are often women who have overstayed their visas, and they don't have green cards. They're here illegally, and with restrictions on immigration, there is definitely a deficit in the number of caregivers who could be hired. So that is another problem. But I think the major problem is that the government doesn't do anything to help. Do you know how much it costs a family to care for a family member with dementia? About $80,000 a year. Okay. If you take in all the costs, that is just a huge amount. For most families cannot do that. And the fact is that, there's very little support in India too. But in India, there's sort of a cultural, there's a culture that promotes families taking care of the elderly. In America, there's a nuclear family, and then the government doesn't really help. So then when it's fine and dandy until someone gets sick, and then what do? Most people think that the government's going to step in. They're just confused. I myself, even as a doctor, would say, well, he has Medicare. That should help, right? No, it doesn't help at all. Unless he was just discharged from the hospital, in which case he could get maybe 2 weeks of a visiting nurse service until he gets better. Or if he's has 6 months to live and gets enrolled in hospice. But most elderly people don't fall into those groups. So there's very little to do. So it becomes a massive challenge.
I'm going to open it up for questions soon, so I hope you all are thinking about some of the things you want to ask Sandeep. But before we do that, I want you to talk about how you came to the decision to write the book. Again, I think if I can extrapolate from what I read and learned about you, it's because you really do feel that there needs to be more information out there for people to understand or prepare themselves for what's ahead, or to avoid some of the challenges that you had.
Yeah, I had never planned on writing this book. When I was going through this, I was just trying to keep my head above water, with, juggling all these different roles. And it was incredibly hard. And again, I can only imagine how hard it is for people who don't have resources, don't have siblings, who are, more or less on the same page. Families break up because of this. And people literally people die. Caregivers die because of the stress that they're put under, because of lack of resources and because of lack of help from the government. So sorry, what was your question?
Well, the process of writing the book.
Yeah. So there are so many things that were sort of swirling through my head, but my initial reaction was, I just want to forget all of this. Like when my dad died, I was like, do I really want to revisit all that, all the pain and so on? But I'd say sometime around COVID, I started to think, this is something that I might want to write about. But the writing sort of took place in fits and, stop, start. I would start writing and then I'd say, this isn't really working and this is not making me happy. I don't really want to do this. But then, as I started, writing is also a process of clarifying, right? So I didn't understand some of the conundra, with truth-telling versus dignity. Some of the things that I had been going through, I didn't really understand that this is part of a larger story. And so, eventually I said, look, I want to write about this so that, people can understand that they're not alone. That even though it's the most lonely experience, but, I wanted to write the book that I needed. And I didn't have a book. There were, of course, books about, the 36-hour day and, sort of these practical self-help books, but there wasn't a book that sort of had the sort of wrenching personal chronicle that you can identify with, and some practical tips, and then the science. And I wanted to put that all together into a sort of a scientific memoir. So that's the reason.
You're reminding me that in that interview, you said, I wanted to write the book that I needed when I was going through this. So
Yeah.
Let's open it up for questions. We have one here. And introduce yourself for us, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Whitney Downard. I'm with the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. I listened to your NPR interview that they sent out, and one of the things you talked about was how important it was to have that cultural competency with that home caregiver, and that wasn't something I'd really thought about. Can you give me more of an example about the difference between having the non-Indian caregiver and then how the adjustment was so much easier, not better, but easier with a culturally competent caregiver who actually knew what your dad's background was like personally?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, there was just a sense of mistrust from my father when we hired caregivers who didn't really understand him, didn't understand sort of his needs. He would tell us that so-and-so we had hired was, showing off. And I said, what do you mean by that, Dad? Because she didn't respond to him the way that he needed her to. When we were talking about finding a place, there was sort of this axe that was hanging over our heads, which is once this almost perfect caregiver leaves, what are we going to do? No one's going to be able to deal with him. I refused to put him in a nursing home. So there was a lot of a little bit of infighting. And I remember one time I just blurted out, he needs Indian food. And my sister said, fuck Indian food. You guys can take him Indian food 3 times a week to the nursing home. But I knew that my dad, he was just, used to a certain way, and the dementia didn't make him any more flexible than he had ever been. It made him a lot more inflexible. So, so it was just about, I think finding someone who could understand the cultural context. That was really key.
My name is Kathy Ritchie, and I'm with KJZZ News in Phoenix. You said a few things that I just, it always, I'm like, thank you for saying that. The Medicare piece, because I feel like if our baseline is, oh, doesn't Medicare pay for that, which I still hear in my own reporting, it's just like, oh, Lord.
Yeah.
And the money, like when you're dealing with Medicaid to spend down, that sort of thing, it's in my own work, it's the stuff that I just sort of scream with frustration because I don't think so many people realize the immense cost of aging in this country. I'm curious, in your own book, what surprised some of the readers of your book where they were like, oh my God, I mean, was it the money piece? What was it that sort of they stood back and said, I had no idea?
I think just the overall nightmare of it,
It
you know?
is.
I mean, people who've been through it understand, but, call it whatever you will, the silver tsunami or whatever, but dementia is coming for all of us, whether as patients or as caregivers. And we're just unprepared. Most people don't know. And so, yeah, I think people who read it who haven't been through it, but maybe have an aging parent, hopefully they understand a little bit better that, unless a lot changes, they're in for a very tough ordeal.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I also appreciate what you said about the regret, because my mother had FTD, and I can appreciate your regret of, like, you don't know what you don't know, and then you look back and you're like, oh my God. So
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story.
In my experience, the reason why a lot of caregivers have regrets is, well, because they become impatient, they become angry. They're angry at the disease, but then they manifest anger at the person, their loved one. So it just becomes just a very challenging thing, all around.
Hi, I'm Amber Castillo from Epicenter NYC, a local news outlet, and I'm curious about how you and your siblings navigated talking to your dad about his health and what you did and didn't say, and also when you came around to it, how you and your siblings navigated truth-telling and keeping each other and yourselves on the same page when you're not in the way that you're telling him the truth or not telling him.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of disagreement about that, but the slate was wiped clean every evening. I would say it was like the Etch-a-Sketch that you just shake it and it's just gone, right? So no matter if I told him the truth or if my brother told him a lie, by tomorrow it was all forgotten. And so, but yeah, I mean, eventually, I think I just had to go through a period of acceptance that he was, no longer the person, that I grown to know and love, respect. I had needed him so much, when I was growing up. And it took me a long time, longer than my siblings, to accept that he was no longer the same father. My brother would say, especially toward the end, he's living a life of plus minus, which I think he meant it just adds up to zero. And I didn't have such a stark assessment of things. I think that there were certain aspects to his life that, even in the throes of dementia, that gave him pleasure. In some ways, we were, and I wrote about this in the book, we were suffering over him more than he was. just watching him decline. That became especially difficult toward the end because he had written this advance directive that said, if I get really sick, don't save me, don't do anything extraordinary. And when he finally took the downturn, which was very rapid, and we weren't sure, is this like an infection? Is this a bladder infection? Is this pneumonia? Is this what? I would say, well, maybe we should give him antibiotics. My brother said he didn't want any extraordinary measures. I said, well, this isn't that extraordinary. But more to the point, he doesn't seem that unhappy. He doesn't, he's not, we're suffering over him more than he is. There were still moments of pleasure, even in the throes of moderate to severe dementia. He enjoyed spending time with his caregiver. He liked seeing me, when I would come to visit. He would smile, he'd laugh. He liked watching television. He liked eating ice cream. These were like little things. And my brother viewed this as, these are simple pleasures. They're beneath him. The man who wrote that advance directive would say, like, this is exactly what I don't want. I don't want people to view me as this, this simpleton, this child. And I said, that's fine. I understand your point. But he never once said, I want to die, even when he was declining. When I would ask him, Dad, do you want to, continue like this? He'd say, of course. I want to live as long as possible. But he had written this advance directive. So what do you follow? The advance directive? Or, do you pay more attention to this sort of the rational foresight of the person who is a scientist? Or do you pay more attention to the person in front of you who doesn't seem that unhappy? So that became a difficult thing, toward the end. But I and now I remember when I was asked about regret. Most caregivers have regret because they're prisoners of their own rational minds. We think rationally, so we think someone else should think rationally. So when that person doesn't think rationally, it creates anger. And most people are truth tellers. So you want to tell the truth. You want to be rational. You want to, and maybe people who have more experience with a family member who has maybe a mental illness, have longer experience, can understand, well, you can't be rational. You have to connect with them on a different way. That's outside the rational plane, non-rational. But I didn't have any experience with it. So I would get angry with him. Like stop doing this. But he couldn't help himself, and I think that's what a lot of caregivers go through.
It's a fascinating discussion. It's certainly making me remember some challenges. We had a question over here.
Hi, Andy Richards, NJ Advanced Media. I wanted to thank you for sharing everything that you went through with us, and you for asking such brilliant questions. I am in the throes of it right now. My mom is 87, she has dementia, I'm the sole caretaker. I've been doing no, I'm not Pat, I'm Andrea. That thing that you said doesn't make sense to them. To that young lady, when I try to explain to my mom, well, your brain is not functioning the way it did before. No, it's fine. And the cultural competency, we're Jamaican, the food, big deal. But I guess my question to you is, because this freaks me out, if I forget something, I'm like, oh my God, am I getting dementia? Do you go through that? Is this a concern? Is that something that you thought about as you were going through it with your dad?
I just thought about it 5 minutes ago when I forgot my response. I think about it all the time, yeah.
Yeah.
But, look, I mean, I have senior moments, but I don't think of myself as a senior. But I do have moments where I'll like walk into a room and kind of forget, what was I doing? Why am I here? I will forget where I parked my car. But I don't forget that I have a car. I don't forget the type of car I have. So I think it's a question of degree.
So you don't go into absolute panic. I go into absolute panic. I'm like,
I would go into absolute panic if you forget that you have a Toyota, and then I think that's a significant issue. But if you forget where you parked your Toyota, I don't think it's a big deal.
A few days ahead of my birthday, you've given me a terrific gift here. As long as I remember I have glasses, then I'm still okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Nina Keck with Vermont Public. You talked about the advance directive. My husband and I were just going over ours and kind of updating them. Both of his parents, his father died of Alzheimer's, very brilliant guy, sounded very similar to your father. But has this made you think differently about your own advance directive?
Yeah, I mean, Terry Gross asked me that on Fresh Air, and I was totally unprepared. And I'm still unprepared because I still haven't written my advance directive. I probably should. But, I think advance directives are less important than healthcare proxies. Because things change, right? You can't spell everything out in a document. So I've thought about who would I want to be my healthcare proxy, like my brother, although I'm afraid he'd just want to pull the plug. So, I don't know. So, but he's a very rational person whom I tremendously respect.
Just don't trust him.
So, I remember Terry Gross asked me this question, well, what would you want, And I said, well, I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. And then I got a little blowback from readers and got a lot of emails. Well, don't you think that caring for your father was a blessing in some ways? That you got close to him, you had this very profound human experience. Why would you want to deny your children that experience? Yeah, I mean, I don't really buy it. It's not, one of the saddest things for me was to think of him in a different way than I used to. He was a person I tremendously respected, and someone who I always turned to for help. And then to watch him decline like that, I don't want my kids to see me that way. So that was my answer then, and it's kind of still my answer now. But I don't think that's exclusive of having an advance directive. But I do think advance directives have their issues, that they're not sort of like a panacea. I think it's better to have a human being who understands you and knows what your preferences are and is with you along the way to make, to change things around as your life progresses, because we're not the same person we were, like when I'm 80, I'm not going to be the same person I was when I was 50, and it's hard to project into the future and know exactly what I want. So, yeah.
Let's take a few more questions from anyone else who hasn't asked one yet. If not, we'll go back to you, Kathy. No problem.
kind of wanted to follow up on that and get your thoughts on long-term care insurance for those who can actually still get it and or afford it.
Yeah, I mean, no one tells you that you should have not long-term care insurance. And then when people want to buy it, it's too late. So for myself, no, I haven't. I still think of myself as like too young for that, but maybe that's, just the wrong way of thinking about it. But we didn't have it for our parents. Most people don't have it. It's very expensive. So most people try to hide assets, give them to kids and sort of declare poverty essentially so that they can be eligible for Medicaid, but then Medicaid has a look back. So, and it was like 5 years or something. So, most people are not going to survive that long. If you're already thinking about long-term care, a 5-year look back is not going to, help you. 7 years. Yeah.
I was curious, and this is sort of piggybacking off of another question, but when you had the disagreements with your siblings about, how to whether to lie to your father, the best way to make him comfortable, that sort of thing, how did you all manage to navigate that? And also, have you found any resources that would help caregivers navigate that emotional part of the experience that they're having?
Specifically with regard to truth-telling?
My brain just glitched for a second, but not that, just navigating all of the difficult parts of being a caregiver and thinking more of the emotional and mental health aspect of it. And I'm Marquita Brown.
Oh, hi.
Freelance writer.
Yeah. I haven't seen books that explore that, at least in a way that I would want, which is, again, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to explore some of these sort of emotional issues in caregiving. But, like the truth-telling piece was difficult. There was a lot of disagreement for a long period of time. Eventually, my siblings won out because I saw the validity of what they were doing, and I saw the cruelty of what I was inflicting on my father just for the sake of some sort of like ethical ideal. And so it took me a while to change my thinking about that. But so what I was doing with truth-telling was this sort of orientation, this sort of caregiving strategy called reality orientation. And there's a competing perspective that's really taken hold in the last, I'd say since the mid-1990s, and I explore this a lot in the book. Some people call it, therapeutic deception is essentially like the term that there's another term doesn't sound as bad, but I don't remember it. But therapeutic deception is sort of this strategy where you tell people what they need to hear to save them from being upset. And I really learned about that on a trip to Amsterdam, where I went to the Hoogwijk, which is a dementia village right outside of Amsterdam, where the guide there really sort of took me on a walk. It's a fascinating place. It's in chapter 9 of the book. If you want to just jump to it's one of the most, and that's where I really explore the truth-telling conundrum. But the guy who was walking me through said, "Look, this is not lying. because I was asking him about it, because Hoagawake is like, it's like the Truman Show. You know, you have like these caregivers who are posing as gardeners, you know, and you have this village where the residents, all of whom have moderate to severe dementia, can wander around and sort of, you know, and we don't allow that in America, because in America, you know, we have decided that this sort of perennial question of safety versus security or autonomy, okay, should be decided for safety, right? So we lock people up in memory units and not allow them to wander so that they can't fall and break their hip. The guy who was showing me around said, you know, we have this fountain. People, when we built it, people said, oh, you can't have a fountain because the residents, what if they like climb into the fountain? You know, and he said, you know, people with dementia aren't stupid. You know, they're not going to climb over a fence and jump into a fountain. You know, but he's like, this is the difference between our way of doing it here in Europe, in this dementia village, and what you do in nursing homes in America. And dementia villages are coming to the U.S. There's one in sort of one in Ohio. There's one in San Diego. I think one's being built in Atlanta. You know, but anyway, the point was that on this tour, the tour guide was actually one of the founders of the Dementia Village, and he said that, you know, what did he say? He said it's not lying. He's like, is it lying when we tell children that there's a Santa Claus? You know, and you can quibble about the analogy there, but you know, he said, look, you know, if you tell someone who's desperate to see their daughter that, oh, your daughter's coming, then you've spared them a lot of agony, and so why not do that? And that was really the first time where I sort of started grappling with, and I understood that this is exactly what I was doing in my own life.
Hearing that.
Yeah.
What I was asking about was more about the emotional toll that caregivers
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
and how do you know, navigate that? How do you navigate even the emotional tension, or, you know, the tensions with siblings? And were you able to find any resources that were able to help with the emotional toll?
Yeah. I mean, I went to caregiver support groups. The Alzheimer's Foundation on Long Island had a great support group that I went to, you know, on weekends to hear. You know, I think it's just because it's such a difficult and lonely experience. It really helps to have group support is super important. But not everyone has the time or the inclination to go and sit in a group. So yeah, so that was really one of the reasons why I wanted to explore some of that emotional difficulties in the book, to show that what I went through, and that eventually you emerge from it, you know, not quite unscathed, but you do emerge.
Unless there are any more pressing questions, it doesn't look like there is. I just wanted to say to you that, I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but the way you share your journey and your honesty in doing it brought back a lot of memories and thoughts about me, and in particular my mother and her passing and her struggle with dementia. But I just wanted to reiterate something that you said earlier. When you said that you wanted to write the book that you needed, I think you've written the book that just about everybody in this room needed. And certainly anybody who hears you talk about this or reads your book will feel the same way. So I'd like us to take this opportunity right now to thank Sandeep Jauhar for joining us. Thank you so much. So we now will have a few minutes to unwind, relax before our dinner begins. But once again, I do want to thank everybody for being here. Excited about the next couple of days, and I think we can look forward to more incredible conversations like this one. So.